Welcome to the Into AI Safety podcast, where we document my shift to a career in AI safety. This show aims to serve as a mentorship proxy for those getting into the field, and a mentorship amplifier for our guests and myself. As always, I'm your host, Jacob Haynes. Hey everyone, today we're going to be talking about the future of the show and some of the developments that are going to be happening in the near future. So I just want to give a TLDR up front, or a TLDL, I suppose, and that is that I want to make this podcast sustainable, and right now it's not. I want to make sure that the podcast is actually contributing towards my current goals in the best way possible, and I don't think it is right now. So I'm going to make some changes, and I think that it's going to end up getting us to a place that is much more aligned with what I want to be doing. Okay, so now the longer version. I have a friend, Pete, and he has a ton of experience with podcasts. I was able to speak with him for some advice on my show and how to make it more sustainable. The first thing that he said about my podcast when we met was that it sounded professional, but it also sounded like I wasn't having any fun. Now, I think this was really important for me to hear, because any content that I am creating which isn't fun probably isn't that accessible. And the content's probably not going to be fun if I'm not having fun myself. I think I've somewhat addressed this within the 2 episodes since then, but I'm going to be more myself when I'm on the microphone, because there's no reason that an academic can't be themselves and can't have fun and can't make jokes. If I want a career in scientific communication, I have to be able to goof around and be myself doing that. The second item, which I also definitely needed to hear, was that I need to ask for money if I want money. This sounds pretty obvious when you think about it, but asking for money is something that I, at least, have a hard time doing, even when it is an equitable exchange. But Pete's right. No one is going to message me and say, hey, I liked your podcast and I want to make it sustainable so that you can do it more. Here, have some money to do that. That's just not going to happen. My Patreon, which is linked in the show notes, my show bio, and on my website, was created to at least begin to address this problem. We'll get back to the Patreon in a couple minutes, though, because it's also relevant to a future item that I'm going to bring up. Associated with this one is also the idea that sustainability does not only mean funding. For the podcast to be sustainable, I need to be able to keep doing it and not get burnt out or overworked. Similarly to the Patreon, we'll revisit this one later. Now, the last and most important takeaway from the conversation wasn't a single point that Pete gave, but was instead a realization that I had during our conversation. To start, Pete had asked me to tell him why I was making the podcast. Here is the most coherent version of my response. Note that this is absolutely not what I had said during our meeting, but it had the same sentiment behind it, and I think it's a little bit more clear for you guys, as well as myself. I believe that the technologies encompassed by artificial intelligence are going to be transformative, meaning that the impact of the technology will be roughly equivalent to that of the Industrial Revolution. In addition, advanced machine learning systems are very complex, meaning that by default, the general public understanding is going to be surface level at best. However, it seems to me that the best way to increase the likelihood that AI goes well is to have as many people meaningfully involved in the conversation surrounding the rules and limitations placed on the research, development, deployment, and use of the technology. This isn't a novel idea either. In fact, it can pretty much be summarized by saying that I want AI to be subject to a maximally democratic process. Sorry, the urge to say jargon was just too strong there. What I mean is that if we can actually get everyone's opinion on this very complex problem, we'll converge to a better solution than we would have if we allowed individuals or small groups to make the decisions for everyone. Now, this is not a trivial task, but one way that I can use my experience is to create accessible content regarding these systems, which will increase both the number of individuals that can engage in these important conversations and the extent to which people can contribute to them as well. Before I continue unpacking that conversation, let's just take a brief detour to discuss the inconsistency that some of you may have already noticed. This purpose, the one that I just mentioned, it's not the same as the one that is currently in my intro. If you hadn't realized that yet, don't worry, I hadn't either. When I started the podcast, my personal goal was much closer to the sentiment, make a career for myself in AI safety and help people along the way. So that is also the target that I developed this podcast around. Importantly, it was a goal that I felt I had the experience to make traction on. Since then, I have worked with a number of fantastic people. First, I of course have to mention Chase Procopia, who wrote and recorded all the background music heard throughout the podcast and also does the audio editing. He is a performer as well, and has many friends who are digital artists professionally. Through conversations I've had with him, I began to realize how possible it is to bring these complex ideas to people with little to no machine learning experience, and why that is so important. Equally as important is the fact that, prior to my discussions with him, the impact that large image generation models have had on digital artists was not something that I was really tracking. So thank you, Chase. Not only for everything you do for the podcast, but also for not being afraid to have a real conversation about difficult and complex issues.
You're welcome.
My work through the Apart Research Fellowship has also contributed a lot towards the shift of my goals. Through it, I have been able to work with many other dedicated and talented individuals getting into the field, have my work and thought processes productively critiqued, and recognize some of the areas in which I can help contribute meaningful feedback for others. The result is not only that I have been able to build some skill in these areas, but I think probably more importantly, that I have been able to build the confidence that I'm actually of value to other work in this field. And I think that's really important for specifying and honing your goal. Now that I have more of an understanding of what I'm contributing, I can better align that with the thing that I want to be doing for my career and how I want to impact others. My work through AI Safety Camp has also been incredibly useful, with my project lead, Brian Penny, providing many invaluable resources and giving really solid, actionable advice. And he also connected me with Dr. Peter Park, who was on the interview last week. It's important to note that both Brian and also Dr. Igor Krawchuk, who is a future guest on the podcast, brought to my attention what I would call reasonable criticisms of effective altruism, or EA. By actually engaging with people who want to have a conversation about opposing viewpoints, I've been able to land on a perspective that is truly my own and is not perfectly aligned with that of Brian, Igor, Dr. Park, or EA. I'm not sharing this simply to credit all these people. Although I definitely do want to do that, my main purpose was to highlight that by working with people with different perspectives and different backgrounds, I have been able to more efficiently piece together what I believe to be the goals that I should be working towards. So I guess maybe the valuable piece of information here is for listeners who find themselves in a similar situation in the future to find people who you are comfortable with and who are willing to give you straightforward feedback and have difficult conversations. Especially when you're looking for people who meet this criteria and have expertise in at least one of the areas you're wanting to focus on, it can be really difficult to locate them. But trust me, they are out there. Anyways, all that was to say, after working more directly in the field and engaging with many diverse perspectives, I was able to refine my personal objective. And it turns out that it isn't the same as the one that I had started with originally. But I think that's probably a good thing. All right, so let's bring it home. What has all of this been moving towards? Well, I still think that the initial goal of my podcast is valuable thanks to the feedback I have received. Along those lines, I'd like to give a quick shout out to Reed, who found me on Discord and let me know that they were finding my show very useful. It's really great to hear feedback like this, and it helps me know that I'm addressing something that is important to address. So, even though I want to move the podcast in a slightly different direction, I also wanted to make sure I could keep contributing towards my initial purpose. Based on episode play numbers, it also seems that the hackathon episodes are less listened to, which makes sense. They are definitely not targeted at as wide of an audience. At the same time, though, I still want to make them accessible as a tool for people to use. So, starting now, all future research ride-along content, such as my MINISODE on portfolios, the feedback episodes, and the hackathon episodes, will be published to Patreon. Sometime this week, I will be removing those from the podcast RSS feed, but they will remain on the Into AI Safety podcast website for the foreseeable future so that they can still be accessed. However, future content similar to those kinds of episodes will only be accessible on my Patreon. This means that if you like the work because you really like the in-depth look that you get into how I'm doing things, you should definitely consider joining my Patreon community. Now, the flip side of making the Patreon is that I will have to reduce the amount of content that I'm able to put on the podcast feed. Add to that I am currently being stretched super thin with multiple different projects going simultaneously. Once a week is going to be too much for at least the next couple months. After thinking about all of my different projects and their timelines, I think the following framework makes the most sense. The interview with Dr. Park, has 2 more episodes, which will be released as planned on the next 2 Mondays. After that, I'm thinking I will release the episodes from the Hackathon subseries every other week on Patreon until they are completed. Last but definitely not least, I also have a lengthy interview that I recorded with the now Dr. Igor Kravchuk. I will be releasing that in some combination of episodes on the Into AI Safety podcast in late April or early May. This does mean that the Into AI Safety feed won't be receiving updates for a little while after the interviews with Dr. Park, are published. Finally, I would really like to get more feedback from my listeners and incorporate it into the show. To further incentivize the Patreon, I will be asking some questions within the coming weeks about what would be the most valuable for both listeners and patrons. One thing that I already know I would like to hear people's thoughts on is whether to release the interview with Igor as a single, probably 3-ish hour episode, or to split it up as I did with Dr. Park's interview. If you have an opinion on this, I would love to hear from you over at patreon.com/intoAIsafety. Oh, also, you can pitch sign-offs, since I feel like see you next time is a little boring. That means I have to come up with a temporary one, and I thought of this one a couple minutes ago. I think it spices it up, at least enough. So long, Spider-Man!